The Great Seal of the Cherokee Nation. It is an image of enduring power, depicting a seven-pointed star and a wreath of oak leaves, symbols of unity and resilience. In the late 19th century, this seal represented a sovereign government, a legal system, and a people who had rebuilt their lives after the Trail of Tears. But in 1898, a quiet storm began to gather over the nation's capital in Tahlequah. It was a storm of ink and paper, of laws written far away in Washington, D.C., that would tear the fabric of this nation apart from the inside. It began with a discovery, not in a dusty courthouse, but deep beneath the surface of the Grand River, a wide, slow-moving river that cuts through the heart of the Cherokee Nation. The discovery was made by a man named Silas Grover, a water witch a Dowser hired to find a reliable source of water for a new rail line that the Katy Railroad was pushing through the territory. Grover was a gaunt man with a weathered face, a relic of a bygone age who used a forked peach branch to find what the earth hid. On a cool October morning, as he walked the river's edge near the town of Fort Gibson, his divining rod did not just dip, it snapped violently downward, as if wrenched by an invisible hand. Fascinated, he borrowed a shovel from a nearby farmhand and began to dig. He dug for nearly an hour, his curiosity turning to unease as he found nothing but dry, rocky soil. He was about to give up when the blade of his shovel struck something solid with a dull clang. He scraped away the dirt to reveal a metal box, rusted and caked with mud, its lock, a heavy iron mechanism, corroded beyond recognition. He had to break the lock with a rock. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the moisture, was a leather-bound journal. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded, but still legible. It was not a diary of daily life, but a ledger of debts owed to a man named Theophilus Barker. A ledger of debts found buried by a river might not, to most, seem like the key to a vanished world. But to anyone who understood the history of this land, it was a ghost from a brutal past. Theophilus Barker was not just a man, he was the name of a phantom. His name had appeared in whispered stories and fragmented court records for decades, a shadowy figure who was said to be the head of a secret organization that operated in the shadows of the Cherokee Nation. The ledger was a death list, and the debts were not money, they were secrets. The discovery of this simple book would reveal a conspiracy so deep that it reached from the back alleys of Tahlequah to the halls of the United States Congress, a conspiracy that connected the Doolin Dalton gang to the highest courts in the land, and a secret that had remained buried for over a decade. This is the story of the Dawes Commission's Dark Echo, a forgotten chapter of the American frontier, and the last days of a nation that was being quietly erased. It is a story of an obscure law called the Curtis Act, the rise of a shadowy secret society known as the Nighthawks, and the murder of a man who knew too much. A man named Moses Whitmire. The year is 1898, and the setting is the Cherokee Nation in Indian Territory. For decades, the so-called five civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, Creek, and Seminole, had governed themselves. They had their own constitutions, their own courts, and their own citizens, both Indian and those of European descent who had been adopted into the tribes or had married into them. But that autonomy had always been a point of contention for the United States government, and the discovery of gold, coal, and rich agricultural land only intensified the pressure to open these tribal lands to white settlement. The force behind this push was the Dawes Commission, established in 1893. Its original purpose was to negotiate with the tribes to abolish their tribal governments and allot their communal land to individual citizens, a process designed to break up tribal sovereignty and encourage assimilation. The tribes, however, were unified in their refusal to negotiate. They had treaties with the United States that guaranteed their land and their independence, and they were determined to hold on to them. But in Washington, patience had worn thin. The architect of the next phase was a man named Henry L. Dawes, a U.S. Senator from Massachusetts, for whom the commission was named. In June of 1898, acting on his recommendation, Congress passed the Curtis Act. This law was a legislative hammer. It unilaterally dissolved the tribal courts and governments of the five civilized tribes, stripping them of their sovereignty. It mandated that a new roll of citizens be created to determine who would be eligible for an allotment of land. The commission's work was no longer a negotiation, it was an enforcement. When the news reached Tahlequah, the Cherokee capital, it was met not with open rebellion, but with a deep, simmering fury that expressed itself in quiet defiance. The Cherokee Nation's Supreme Court, a court that had been in operation for over half a century and was as respected as any in the Union, was ordered to close its doors on September 1, 1898. The Indian Police, a force that had been the only law for hundreds of thousands of square miles, were to be disbanded. In their place would come federal marshals, a force that was vastly understaffed, underfunded, and unfamiliar with the land, the people, or the intricate web of relationships that defined life in the territory. This is where our central character enters the story. We first meet Moses Whitmire in the fading light of a late September afternoon. He was sitting on the porch of his small, clapboard house on the outskirts of Tahlequah, a testament to a life lived in both worlds. His father was a white man, a Scottish trader who had come west with the earliest wave of settlers. His mother was a full-blood Cherokee. He was a product of this liminal space, fluent in both English and Cherokee, educated in the tribal school system, but also a veteran of the Civil War, having served as a scout for the Union's Indian Home Guard. After the war, he had studied law, not in the white man's universities, but with the elders, the keepers of the law, who held the unwritten, sacred legal traditions of the Cherokee in their memories. In his early 50s, Moses was a man who embodied the doomed dignity of his people. He was a record keeper, a clerk in the Cherokee Supreme Court. His life's work had been the meticulous transcription of land claims, inheritance disputes, and criminal cases. He spent his days amidst the smell of old paper and ink, in the chambers of the Cherokee Supreme Court building, an impressive two-story stone structure that stood as the physical embodiment of the nation's sovereignty. It was in this building, on a sweltering day in May of 1898, that a federal marshal named Elias Ponder arrived. Pruitt was a man of imposing stature, with a thick, drooping mustache and eyes that seemed to hold no warmth. He was a member of the silk-stocking class of marshals, men appointed not for their local knowledge but for their political connections. He was among the first to be dispatched to Tahlequah to facilitate the new federal order. He didn't introduce himself so much as announce his presence. Whitmire. I am here to begin the process of inventorying the court's records for federal review. I will need access to all case files, and you'll be conducting me. Moses did not flinch. This is a court of a sovereign nation, he said quietly, not a storage room for your office. I answer to the Chief Justice. You do not, Pruitt sneered, leaning forward. The sovereign nation you think still exists is an illusion. By September, this court is gone. You won't have a job. The only question is whether you'll have a prison record for interfering with a federal investigation. That confrontation was the first tremor of the earthquake to come. Pruitt was not just a federal marshal, he was a man with an agenda that went far beyond his assigned duties. His arrival coincided with a chilling new phenomenon. As the September deadline approached and the Cherokee court system prepared to close, a series of mysterious fires began to break out. It started with a small blaze at a general store in the town of Claremore. Then, a barn was torched on a farm outside Veneta. Soon, the pattern became terrifyingly clear. Every building targeted was either the home of a tribal official, a location tied to the tribal government, or the residence of a citizen who was known to be vocally opposing the Dawes Commission. The federal marshals, led by Pruitt, were often the first on the scene. They would trample through the evidence, their heavy boots destroying tracks and leaving behind a mess that made forensic investigation, already primitive, all but impossible. Their conclusion was always the same. They'd declare it an unfortunate act of arson by persons unknown, or, more cynically, they'd blame the owners themselves for insurance fraud. They were not investigating the crimes, they were obstructing the investigations. Moses began to connect the dots. The fires were not random acts of violence. They were strategic. They were also a ritual of intimidation. A message was being sent to the Cherokee leadership: you have no protection anymore. The Nighthawks, as the white-owned newspapers had begun to call the perpetrators, were alluded to in dark, vague terms, describing groups of armed men who rode by night. They were the agents of a conspiracy to terrify the tribal citizens into submission, to facilitate the seizure of their land and resources. In his own quiet, meticulous way, Moses began to collect evidence. He made careful notes of the dates and times of the fires, the locations, and the names of the victims. In the final days before the court closed, he made an enormous, dangerous decision. He knew that many records in the Cherokee court would be vulnerable to theft or destruction. He began taking them home with him. Each night, he would slip into the courthouse after the few remaining deputies had left for the day, and he would gather up ledgers, birth certificates, land grants, and testimony transcripts. He hid them in a false compartment he'd built in the floor of his study, under a stack of books. He was creating a hidden archive, a duplicate of the official record that he believed would be needed in the future, when the truth would have to be told. But as he documented the crimes, he became a target himself. He began to notice that he was being followed. A lone rider would appear on the trail behind him, keeping a steady, menacing distance. A rock was thrown through his window one night, shattering the glass. Then, the final message was delivered. He found his dog, a loyal old hound named Chata, dead in the backyard. It wasn't shot. It was poisoned. A warning he couldn't ignore. That same week, a cattle drive was passing through the territory. It was a massive herd, being pushed north by a crew of hard, weather-beaten cowboys. But a few of these cowboys were not who they seemed. They broke off from the herd and rode into Tahlequah. Moses was at his home, packing a satchel, preparing for a journey he was not sure he would survive. He heard the heavy footsteps on his porch and the splintering of his door as it was kicked open. He had only a moment to grab a worn, leather-bound ledger, the one he'd been holding, and shove it into his satchel before they were on him. They were 4 men. One of them was tall, with a livid scar running down his cheek. Another was wiry, with quick, nervous eyes. There was no introduction, no demand for information, no question. They simply fell upon him with a brutal, methodical silence. They beat him with their fists and the butts of their revolvers, but not to kill. Not yet. They wanted a specific record, a ledger of an old, unsolved case. They wanted to know who had seen what, and when. In the scuffle, they tore the satchel from Moses's grasp. The contents spilled out onto the floor. They grabbed the ledger he had just hidden and began to page through it. It was a record of a trial from 1885, a trial regarding a man named George T. Jones, who had been accused of murdering a white man named John P. Catlett. The case had been dismissed on a technicality, and the evidence had gone missing. Moses now had the missing evidence, a set of witness statements that contradicted the official record. The hell is this? The Nighthawks are dead, one of them spat. You think this matters? This is old news. Where's the other one? The one from the Curtis case? The Curtis case. Moses's heart sank. He knew what they were talking about. It was a file he had kept hidden in the floorboards, not in the satchel. It was a file that could tear open the entire conspiracy. He forced himself to speak, his voice raspy. I don't know what you're talking about. Please. I have nothing of value. The man with the scar laughed. It was a hollow, chilling sound. We'll see about that. They began to ransack the house. They ripped books from shelves and threw them into the fireplace. They tore the mattress with their knives. They did not find the hidden compartment. They were looking for a different kind of evidence, a list of names, a map, a signed confession. For reasons Moses would not understand until much later, they found what they were looking for. It wasn't under the floorboards. It was hidden in plain sight. It was a green cloth-bound book in the corner of the law bookshelves, which held the minutes of a tribal council meeting from years past. They pulled it out, and their demeanor changed. It was as if they'd found a treasure. This is it. The old clerk's book. It's got the mark of the Nighthawks on the spine. Burn it. They didn't burn the house down, but they did burn that single book. They didn't find the Curtis file. They left, satisfied they had destroyed the record. Moses was left for dead. He lay in a pool of his own blood for hours. When he finally came to, he was in immense pain. His family had been away visiting relatives, but a neighbor had heard the commotion and come to find him. Moses knew the attack was a warning, but more than that, it was a confirmation. He was on the right trail. He had to get out of Tahlequah, and he had to take the Curtis file with him. He fled to the home of his sister in a small settlement called Weber's Falls. He was half delirious with fever from his wounds, but the next morning, his mind was clear. He had a mission: to uncover the truth behind the Nighthawks and the conspiracy that was destroying his nation from within. The first step was understanding the enemy. He began to dig through his own memory and the scraps of evidence he had brought with him, including the George T. Jones file. It wasn't just a murder trial. The George T. Jones case was the key to the whole nightmare. The trial, in the summer of 1885, had been a sensation. George T. Jones was a prominent Cherokee citizen, a wealthy rancher and a powerful man in the tribe. He was accused of murdering a white squatter, John P. Catlett. Catlett had been living on land that Jones claimed as his own, and during a dispute over the property lines, Catlett was shot. Jones had always maintained it was self-defense, but there were rumors that it was a gang execution, that Catlett had stumbled upon something he shouldn't have seen. A man named Elijah Hicks had been the lead witness for the prosecution. He was a hard man, a veteran of the Civil War, and a member of the Cherokee law enforcement. He was also known to be a man of unwavering honesty. His testimony had been damning, but on the day the jury was to be seated, Elijah Hicks had disappeared. He simply vanished. Without its star witness, the prosecution had no case. The charges were dismissed. The case file was sealed, a loose end that had finally been tied up. The ledger Moses had been carrying, the one they found in the satchel and ransacked the house to find, contained something that had been omitted from the official record: a letter from Elijah Hicks to Moses Whitmire. In it, Hicks wrote that he had been followed and threatened by members of Jones's family. He wrote that he would be willing to testify, but only if he was guaranteed federal protection, which he knew he would not get. He wrote that the killing was not self-defense, and that he had proof, a map to a location in the Cookson Hills where Jones had secreted evidence. He hid the map under a loose plank in his own cabin floor, and when he disappeared, so did the map. After the case was dismissed, Moses had quietly taken this letter from the file and hidden it in a private ledger to protect Hicks's family from reprisal. He had never told anyone about it. Years later, Moses was contacted by a Choctaw freedman, a man named Silas, who claimed to have found the map. But he had died under mysterious circumstances before he could deliver it. The trail went cold. The case of George T. Jones was closed, but it was the gateway to a far greater conspiracy. A conspiracy that had been simmering since the end of the Civil War. The Civil War had been devastating for the Cherokee Nation. The tribe was deeply divided, with some members siding with the Confederacy and others with the Union. After the war, the United States government punished the Cherokee for their role in the rebellion by forcing them to sign a new treaty. Among other humiliations, the treaty allowed for the construction of railroads through the territory and stipulated that a federal court be established in Fort Smith, Arkansas, to handle cases involving non-Indians. This was the beginning of the end, a small crack in the dam of tribal sovereignty that would eventually burst wide open. It was in the chaos of the post-war years that the Nighthawks were born. They were a secret society of white and mixed-blood citizens who had aligned with the Confederacy. Their name, they claimed, came from their nocturnal activities, but it was also a reference to a species of bird of prey. They were the hunters of men. Their goal was not just to maintain their wealth and power, but to actively facilitate the destruction of the tribal government. They saw the Dawes Commission as their salvation. A civilized federal government would protect their property rights, even as the tribes themselves were destroyed. The Nighthawks worked in the shadows, using blackmail, intimidation, and murder to silence opposition. They were connected to a network of wealthy businessmen and politicians, both in Indian Territory and across the border in Arkansas. Their tentacles reached into the county sheriff's offices and, most dangerously, into the Federal Marshal Service itself. Elias Pruitt, the marshal who had come to Tahlequah that day, was a Nighthawk. He was a facilitator, a man who looked the other way while crimes were committed, and who actively participated in the destruction of evidence. But the Nighthawks were not the only ones at work in the shadows. Around the same time, another notorious group was operating in the neighboring Creek Nation. A group known as the Rufus Buck Gang, a band of young, ruthless Creek and African American outlaws, had been terrorizing the territory. They had been carrying out a campaign of robbery and murder, and there was a strong belief that they were somehow connected to the Nighthawks, acting as a deniable asset, a terror weapon that could be deployed against tribal officials. Then there was the Doolin-Dalton Gang. The Dalton Gang had been virtually wiped out in a shootout in Coffeyville, Kansas, in 1892. But Bill Doolin, a former member of the Dalton Gang, had managed to escape and had reformed a new gang. They were the most successful and feared outlaw band in the territory, specializing in train robberies and bank heists. Moses had heard rumors that some of the Nighthawks leaders were secretly funding these gangs, using the proceeds to build a war chest. Moses saw a terrifying possibility: the Nighthawks, the federal marshals, and the outlaws were all pieces of the same dark puzzle. The Curtis Act, by destroying the tribal courts, had removed the one legal barrier that had been protecting the tribes from this unholy alliance. The Nighthawks were using the outlaws to create chaos and terror, and they were using the federal marshals to ensure that the chaos was never investigated. He now knew the name of the man at the center of the web: Theophilus Barker. The very name etched on the ledger found buried by the river. He was a businessman from Arkansas who had moved into the territory in the 1880s. He had started a series of mercantile establishments and was a major landowner. He was also a master manipulator, a man who used his wealth and influence to control the politicians and lawmen of both the territory and the state. He was the financier and the architect of the Nighthawks. He had been funding the outlaws, providing them with information and weapons, and using them to eliminate his political rivals and intimidate anyone who stood in his way. With a clearer understanding of the web, Moses began to investigate the connection between the Nighthawks and the Doolin-Dalton Gang. It was a dangerous game. He began by looking for a man named George Bittercreek Newcomb, a former member of the Doolin-Dalton Gang who had gone into hiding. He tracked him to a small settlement in the foothills of the Ozarks. Moses was a ghost moving through the territory, his Cherokee name allowing him to blend in when he needed to, his knowledge of the back roads and hidden trails giving him a crucial advantage. He found Newcomb working in a livery stable, a shadow of his former self. The outlaw was scared. He told Moses a story that confirmed his darkest suspicions. He said that Barker had been paying them a percentage of the take from their robberies. The gang had been told to focus on trains and banks that were connected to the tribal government. He also claimed that Barker had made a deal with the federal marshals, that they would ignore the gang's activities as long as they didn't kill any white men of good standing, meaning the wealthy businessmen and politicians that Barker wanted to protect. The law's protection was not for all, it was for the wealthy few. George Newcomb's information was the key to a much larger and more dangerous story. It suggested that the Nighthawks were not just a secret society, they were the enforcement arm of a criminal empire. This empire had its tentacles in every level of society, from the highest courts to the lowliest outlaws. Barker was the kingpin, and Elias Ponder, the federal marshal, was his most valuable lieutenant. Moses's next step was to visit the Cookson Hills, the remote and rugged region where Elijah Hicks had hidden the evidence. He had a name now: the Dead Man's Draw. It was a place whispered about by the old-timers, a spot where the river had cut a deep, narrow canyon. It was said that a shootout had taken place there during the Civil War, and that a man had been buried with a fortune in gold. He found the cabin. It was a ruin, all but collapsed, but the floorboards were still there. Under the third plank from the wall, just as the letter had described, he found it. It wasn't a map to gold. It was a map to a grave. The grave of a man named John P. Catlett. The man George T. Jones was accused of killing. The map showed that Catlett had not been shot in self-defense, he had been ambushed and murdered by a group of men, including Jones. But the most important detail was a name scratched on the back of a piece of flintstone, partially worn away: Theophilus Barker. Barker had been present at the murder. He had been the one who planned it. Catlett had been an informant. He had discovered that Barker and Jones were behind the Doolin-Dalton Gang. He was killed to keep him silent. Moses had proof. He had the map, and he had the letter from the Nighthawks that he'd found in the book in his study. He had enough to take to a federal judge. He knew his next move was impossible. He would need to go to Fort Smith, Arkansas, to a federal court, and petition for the case to be reopened. But the federal court was a place of hostility to Indian claimants. He would need a white lawyer to argue his case. He began to make his way to Fort Smith. He rode for days, stopping only to rest his horse. He was a marked man. The first sign of danger came in a small town called Mena, Arkansas. He was in a saloon, trying to get information about a judge he was planning to petition. He saw two men in the corner, and he recognized one of them immediately. It was one of the men who had attacked him in his home. The tall man with the scar. He was a federal marshal named John Poker Harkins. Moses knew he had to get out. He slipped out the back and into the stable. He was saddling his horse when he heard a voice behind him. Moses Whitmire. You're a hard man to find. It was Harkins. He was holding a revolver. Moses was not armed. He slowly turned, his hands raised. Your little trip to Fort Smith is over, Harkins sneered. Barker sends his regards. What do you want? Moses asked, his voice calm. I want you to tell me where the evidence is. Where you hid it. Harkins motioned with the gun. You're smart enough to know you're not leaving here alive. But you can make it quick. Or slow. Moses had only one move left. He looked Harkins straight in the eye and said, It's all in the same place. The Curtis case file. It's with my sister. She has instructions to send it to the New York Times if I don't come back. It was a bluff. His sister didn't have the file. He had hidden it in the false compartment at his home. But he had to make Harkins think the evidence had already left his control. You're lying, Harkins growled. He stepped closer, raising the gun. Where is it? Moses reached into his coat. The movement was slow, deliberate. He pulled out a small book, his personal journal, which contained a duplicate of the letter from the Nighthawks he had found in the old council book. Right here, he said, holding it up. The truth is here. And there are copies. As he held out the journal, Harkins snatched for it. At that moment, Moses kicked the horse, which reared and stamped its hooves. It gave him the instant he needed. He dove for a nearby hay bale, rolling behind it just as Harkins fired. The shot went wild, punching a hole in the stable wall. Moses scrambled to his feet and ran. He was an old man, but he ran like a deer. He crashed through the stable door and into the night. He could hear Harkins shouting and the sound of hooves behind him. He threw himself into the undergrowth that bordered the road, rolling down a steep embankment into the dry, rocky bed of a creek. He lay there in the darkness, listening. He could hear the riders thundering down the road, their voices calling to each other. Spread out. He can't have gone far. They didn't find him. He waited in the creek bed until the sounds of the posse faded away. He had won a temporary reprieve, but he knew he couldn't continue to Fort Smith. They were waiting for him. The conspiracy was too powerful. He had to change his plan. He went to the only person he trusted, his old comrade from the war, a white man named John Wesley Miller. Miller was a trader and a friend of the Indian people. He had a small cabin on the edge of the Cherokee Nation, and he gave Moses shelter. For weeks, Moses recuperated. He told Miller everything he had discovered. Miller, a man of action, had connections to a newspaperman in Kansas City who was sympathetic to the Indian cause. He convinced Moses to write down the entire story. Moses sat at a small desk in Miller's cabin, and for days, he wrote. He wrote a detailed, methodical account, from the attack in his home to the truth about the Nighthawks. He put it all down on paper, a 50-page document of breathtaking detail. He took a copy of the document and went back to Tahlequah. He was a ghost returning to the scene of the crime. He wanted to see if his home was being watched. He moved through the town at night, a shadow among shadows. When he reached his property, it was silent. He crept to the back of the house, toward the study. He found the trapdoor. The compartment was empty. They had found the Curtis file after all. And they had taken it. He was too late. But he still had the narrative. He still had his account. And more than that, he had the most shocking piece of evidence he had yet discovered. There were new documents in the files he had saved, ones he had not been able to fully analyze. He began to go through them. And what he found was the hidden motive, the true purpose of the Nighthawks and all their allies. It was land. Specifically, the minerals beneath the land. Coal. An enormous deposit of coal that ran beneath a significant portion of the Cherokee Nation. The Nighthawks were not just interested in disrupting tribal government, they were after the coal. They wanted to control the mining rights, and to do that, they needed the land to be opened up for settlement. They wanted to destroy the Cherokee Nation so they could get their hands on the black gold buried beneath the surface. They were not just corrupt, they were enormously wealthy, and they were about to become even richer. But there was one more secret, one that would explain everything. It was hidden in plain sight, buried in the back of his own mind. The Nighthawks were not a single organization. They had two wings. One was the secret society of wealthy men, the Barkers and the Joneses of the world. But the other wing was the most shocking of all. It was an offshoot of the White Caps, a white supremacist group that was spreading across the American South. This group was run by a man named Tillman West, a smooth-talking, well-educated lawyer and former Confederate officer who had become a prominent landowner. West was the son of a white father and a Cherokee mother, a fact he kept secret. He saw the Indian people as a barrier to progress, an obstacle to the white man's manifest destiny. He and his followers, the Nighthawks, had one goal: to exterminate the Cherokee Nation, not in body, but in spirit, by erasing its identity, its laws, and its claim to its own land. They were the hidden hand that ensured the Curtis Act would be enforced with an iron fist. This was the final, shocking truth: the Nighthawks were not a fringe element, they were the embodiment of the federal government's policy. The same forces that had driven the Cherokee from their homeland in the 1830s were now returning to finish the job. But this time, they were using the power of the law, the might of the courts, and the terror of the outlaw to do it. They were not simply thieves and thugs, they were the agents of the nation's slow, bureaucratic genocide. Moses had his final piece of the puzzle. He wrote the last sentence in his account: "They will not stop until every last acre is in their hands." It is now the present day. We are back in Fort Gibson. The Grand River flows, indifferent to history. The old box, buried for over a century, and the ledger it contained, are now in our hands. It tells the whole story: the names, the dates, the money, the hidden murders, the conspiracy. It is a manuscript of a future that never came to pass for the Cherokee, but it is a story that deserves to be told. The document ends with a final, haunting question. Moses Whitmire wrote it in the margin of the last page, as if he had been haunted by this mystery his entire life. It is a question for us, his audience, separated by a century. It is a question that speaks not just to a historical crime but to the very nature of justice. He writes, "They knew where I lived. They knew what I did. They threatened my family. They killed my dog. They beat me and left me for dead. But they never found the proof of the conspiracy. I am alone in the wilderness. If this account is ever found, ask yourself, why did they let me escape? Why did the marshals, with all their power, never come for me again? Was I never a real threat to them, just a troubled old man to be brushed aside? Or did they think I could do them no harm? Did they think the truth would die with my generation?" That last question hangs in the air. The story of the Nighthawks is not just a tale of greed and betrayal, it's a story about the nature of power, of how the powerful use the law to destroy the weak, and how the memory of that destruction can be hidden for generations. The question of why Moses Whitmire was allowed to live is the most chilling question of all. It suggests the truth was always too big, too powerful to be exposed. That there are forces in the world that know the truth but choose not to hear it. The land was stolen, the nations were broken, and the Nighthawks? They got away with it. History, in the end, was written by the victors. And the voices of the Cherokee, the voices of Silas Grover and Moses Whitmire, remain, in the end, a quiet, lost echo, buried in a box by a river. Their truth is still waiting to be fully heard.